What if I told you that somewhere in the forgotten corridors of human memory, there exists a winter that lasted not months, not years, but millennia? A cold so profound, so all-encompassing, that it rewrote the genetic memory of every creature that survived it. A silence so vast that it swallowed civilizations whole, leaving only whispers in ice. Tonight, we're going to explore something that sleeps beneath the surface of accepted history. Something that the ice has been trying to tell us for decades, if only we knew how to listen. Deep in the heart of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drill down through layers of frozen time. Each core they extract is a chronicle, a diary written in crystals of ancient atmosphere. And within those cores, there's an anomaly, a prolonged cooling period that appears in the data like a scar across the face of our planet's climate record. Not a brief ice age, not a seasonal shift, but something far more unsettling. A cold that persisted for approximately 5,000 years, beginning roughly 12,000 years ago, give or take a millennium. If you're drawn to the kind of history that exists in the space between data and myth, between science and the stories we tell ourselves to sleep at night, consider staying with us on this journey. Leave a marker below. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, and whether you've ever felt the pull of forgotten cold in your bones. The ice cores don't lie. They can't. Trapped within their crystalline structure are bubbles of ancient air, preserved oxygen ratios, isotopic signatures that speak to temperature, precipitation, atmospheric composition. And what they're telling us is disturbing in its implications. Around 10 to 12,000 years before the present, the Earth's climate shifted. But not in the way we typically understand climate shift. Not gradually, not predictably. The cooling was sharp, sustained, global, and it lasted. Imagine that. 5,000 years of winter. To put that in perspective, 5,000 years ago from our present moment takes us back to the early Bronze Age, to the time when Sumerians were pressing the first cities into the Mesopotamian mud. 5,000 years is the entire span of recorded human civilization as we know it. Now imagine that entire span, every empire, every invention, every war and peace. Imagine all of that happening under perpetual winter conditions. But here's where the story becomes more than just climate data. Here's where the ice begins to whisper something our modern minds struggle to accept. If such a winter occurred, it wouldn't have been silent in the archaeological record. It would have left marks, scars, evidence not just in ice, but in bone, in art, in the sudden behavioral shifts of species across continents. And when we truly look without the comfort of our established narratives, we find exactly that. Consider the cave art of Europe. For thousands of years, Paleolithic humans painted the walls of their sacred spaces with images of the world they knew. Mammoths, bison, horses, deer. The art is warm, alive, full of movement and vitality. But then, around 12,000 years ago, something shifts. The art changes. It becomes colder, more desperate. The animals depicted are leaner, struggling. New symbols appear, concentric circles, abstract patterns that some researchers have tentatively identified as representing extreme cold, ice formations, or astronomical phenomena associated with climatic catastrophe. The shift is sudden. It's as if an entire culture, an entire way of seeing the world, transformed in the space of a generation or two. Not gradually, as we might expect from normal cultural evolution, but abruptly, as if something had changed so fundamentally in their reality that even their art, their most sacred means of expression, had to adapt or die. And it wasn't just humans. The megafauna of the Pleistocene, those magnificent creatures that had dominated the earth for millions of years, began to disappear. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, species that had survived previous ice ages, that had weathered countless climate fluctuations, suddenly faced extinction. The traditional explanation points to human hunting pressure. And yes, humans played a role. But the timeline is troubling. The extinctions align too perfectly with the climate anomaly, too precisely with the beginning of that prolonged cold. What if the hunting pressure narrative is incomplete? What if both humans and megafauna were facing something far more catastrophic than competition for resources? What if they were facing the slow starvation of a world locked in perpetual winter? The fossil record shows dramatic population declines across multiple species simultaneously. Not in one region, not in one ecosystem, but globally. From North America to Europe to Asia, the pattern repeats. Large herbivores decline first, then the predators that depended on them, then the scavengers. It's a cascade of extinction that speaks to systemic environmental collapse, not localized overhunting. And here's what keeps researchers awake at night, poring over data in quiet laboratories. The decline is synchronized. Different continents, different ecosystems, different species, all experiencing population crashes within the same narrow window of time. The odds of that being coincidental are astronomical. Something global was happening. Something that affected the entire planetary system. The ice cores tell us it was cold. The art tells us humans knew something terrible was occurring. The bones tell us that life itself was struggling to persist. But what caused it? That's the question that haunts this exploration. That's the mystery sleeping beneath the data. There are theories, of course. There are always theories. Some point to the Younger Dryas event, a well-documented period of climatic cooling that interrupted the warming trend at the end of the last ice age. The conventional explanation involves changes in ocean circulation patterns, particularly the shutdown of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation due to massive freshwater pulses from melting glaciers. It's elegant, it's testable, and it explains much of what we see in the Northern Hemisphere. But it doesn't explain everything. The Younger Dryas, as currently understood, lasted approximately 1,200 years, not 5,000. And while it was severe, particularly in the North Atlantic region, its global impact is debated. Yet the ice core anomalies suggest something more prolonged, more pervasive. Something that went beyond a single disruption to ocean currents and persisted for millennia. What if the Younger Dryas wasn't an isolated event, but the beginning of something far longer? What if what we've been calling the end of the last ice age wasn't an end at all, but a transition into a different kind of cold, not glacial, but prolonged, grinding, devastating in its persistence? Let's follow the evidence deeper. Let's let the cold guide us. In Siberia, beneath the permafrost, mammoth carcasses emerge with startling regularity, preserved so perfectly by the cold that their flesh remains edible after tens of thousands of years. Their stomachs contain undigested vegetation, temperate plants that shouldn't have been growing in Siberia under ice age conditions. It suggests rapid climate shifts, yes, but it also suggests something else. It suggests that the environment these creatures knew could change catastrophically, almost overnight. Now imagine not a single catastrophic freeze, but wave after wave of cold. Prolonged winters that never fully released their grip. Springs that came late, if at all. Summers that barely warmed the surface soil before winter returned. Year after year after year. Century after century. For 5,000 years. If you're still with us in this cold, wandering through these frozen millennia, know that you're not alone. Others are here too, listening, wondering. And if this exploration resonates with something deep within you, consider leaving a small mark of your presence. Not for us, but for the others who will follow this path after you've moved on. The genetic record offers another piece of this puzzle. Population genetic studies of modern humans show evidence of severe bottlenecks. Periods when human populations crash dramatically, leaving genetic signatures of near-extinction events. One of these bottlenecks aligns remarkably well with the timeline we're exploring. Somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years ago, human genetic diversity plummeted. Not gradually, sharply, as if the vast majority of humans simply disappeared from the genetic record. This isn't speculation. It's written in our DNA. Every living human today carries the echo of that bottleneck, that moment when our species teetered on the edge of extinction. We're all descendants of the survivors, the ones who endured whatever it was that killed so many others. But here's what's truly unsettling. Similar bottlenecks appear in other species during the same period. Wolves, bears, bison, even plant species show evidence of severe population reductions in their genetic chronologies. It's as if the entire biosphere contracted, squeezed through a narrow filter of survival, and emerged diminished on the other side. What kind of event creates that pattern? What forces every living thing through the same crucible of survival simultaneously? A 5,000-year winter would do exactly that. Think about it. Not a single catastrophic event that wipes out populations instantly, but a slow, grinding pressure that persists across hundreds of generations. That's what creates bottlenecks. That's what forces radical adaptations or extinction. The quick deaths don't leave genetic signatures, they just end lineages. But prolonged environmental stress, the kind that allows just enough survival to barely maintain populations while constantly culling the weak, the unlucky, the less adapted, that creates the patterns we see in our genes. And there's more. There's always more when you dig into the cold. Tree ring data from ancient bog oaks in Ireland and Germany show extended periods of suppressed growth during this window. Trees that should have been thriving in post-glacial warming instead show rings so narrow they're difficult to count. Evidence of severe environmental stress, possibly from volcanic winters or reduced sunlight reaching the surface. But the suppression continues for centuries, not just the few years we'd expect from a single volcanic event. Lake sediment cores show similar anomalies. Pollen analysis reveals dramatic shifts in vegetation patterns, temperate species retreating, cold-adapted species expanding far beyond their normal ranges. And then, crucially, evidence of ecosystem collapse. Layers of sediment that are biologically empty, representing periods when almost nothing grew, when lakes became nearly lifeless cold pools holding onto existence by the thinnest thread. The picture emerging is one of a planet in prolonged distress. Not the quick catastrophe of an impact winter or supervolcanic eruption. Those leave distinctive signatures and relatively brief disruptions. This is different. This is systemic. This is the climate itself shifting into a new, colder equilibrium and staying there for millennia. Imagine being one of those early humans watching the world freeze. Not all at once, but year by year, noticing that the warm season comes later, that the snow doesn't fully melt, that the hunting grounds you've known your entire life are becoming tundra, that the herds are moving, dying, disappearing, and there's nowhere to go that isn't also becoming colder. How do you explain that to your children? How do you maintain hope when every year is harder than the last, and your grandparents' stories of abundance sound like myths from another world? Perhaps you paint your desperation on cave walls. Perhaps you develop new technologies, better clothing, better shelters, new hunting techniques for a world that no longer offers easy prey. Perhaps you gather around fires and tell stories about the time before the cold, when the world was warm and generous. Perhaps those stories eventually become myths, and those myths eventually become religion. Perhaps you remember, and that memory becomes the foundation of everything that comes after. The question that haunts this inquiry, that whispers from the ice and speaks through the bones, is simple and terrible. What caused it? What force could lock the entire planet in extended winter for 5,000 years? What mechanism could sustain that cold through 50 centuries of human struggle and species extinction? The conventional explanations feel inadequate when confronted with the scope of what we're discussing. Ocean circulation changes can explain regional cooling. Volcanic eruptions can explain brief global temperature drops lasting years or perhaps a decade. Orbital variations, the Milankovitch cycles that drive ice age rhythms, operate on timescales of tens of thousands of years and don't create sudden, sustained cold periods in the middle of deglaciation. Something else was at work. Something we haven't fully identified or understood. There are the more controversial theories. Some researchers point to evidence of extraterrestrial impact, not a single massive asteroid, but perhaps a fragmented comet that bombarded Earth over an extended period, each impact injecting dust and debris into the atmosphere, each one extending the nuclear winter effect. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests exactly this scenario, and while it remains contested in mainstream academia, the evidence continues to accumulate. Nanodiamonds in sediment layers. Platinum anomalies, widespread burn layers suggesting continent-scale fires. But even if we accept the impact hypothesis, it typically explains only centuries of cooling, not millennia. Unless the impacts continued. Unless what we're discussing isn't a single event but a prolonged bombardment. A cosmic siege that lasted generations. Consider the implications. Every few decades, another fragment of a shattered comet screaming out of the night sky. each impact throwing millions of tons of material into the stratosphere. Each one extending the winter, deepening the cold, compounding the catastrophe. Human populations huddling in caves, in valleys, in any shelter they could find, watching the sky with terror and praying to gods they were just beginning to name. Over time, the memory of why the sky was angry might fade. But the memory of the cold, that would persist. That would be written into cultural DNA, into the myths and stories that every culture tells about a time of great darkness, a time when the world nearly ended. If this journey through the cold is resonating with you, if you feel the pull of these ancient mysteries, you might consider marking this moment. Not for any algorithm or metric, but because some explorations are better taken together, and knowing others walk this path makes the darkness less absolute. Or perhaps the cause wasn't cosmic at all. Perhaps it was terrestrial, but on a scale we struggle to comprehend. Supervolcanic eruptions can certainly trigger volcanic winters. The Toba supereruption 74,000 years ago may have reduced human populations to just a few thousand breeding pairs. But Toba's winter lasted perhaps a decade, horrific, catastrophic, but brief in geological terms. Could there have been multiple supereruptions clustered in time? Could the planet have experienced a period of extreme volcanism that persisted for millennia? The geological record should show that. There should be massive ash layers, chemical signatures of repeated eruptions. And while there is evidence of increased volcanic activity during the deglaciation period, the removal of glacial ice sheets can trigger volcanic rebound in susceptible regions. There's no clear evidence of the kind of sustained, repeated supereruptions that would be required to maintain a 5,000-year winter. Unless we haven't found it yet. Unless it's buried beneath ice sheets or ocean sediments, waiting for the right core sample, the right analysis, the right question. The most unsettling possibility is the one least often voiced, that we simply don't know. That the cause remains mysterious because it's something outside our current understanding of planetary systems. Something that didn't leave signatures we recognize, or left signatures we're interpreting incorrectly, or left signatures we haven't thought to look for yet. Science resists gaps. It seeks explanations, mechanisms, causes. But sometimes the honest answer is uncertainty. Sometimes the data points to something real, in this case an extended period of severe global cooling, without revealing its origin. And perhaps that's the most human response of all. To know that something terrible happened, to carry the scars of it in our genes and our stories, but to have lost the memory of why. To remember the cold without remembering what brought it. To remember the hunger without remembering what took the food away. To remember the darkness without remembering what extinguished the light. Look at the myths. Every ancient culture has stories of a great deluge, a great darkness, a time when the world nearly ended. The Greeks spoke of multiple ages of man, each ending in catastrophe. The Norse spoke of Fimbulwinter, a great winter lasting 3 years before Ragnarok, the end of the world. Hindu texts describe cycles of creation and destruction spanning vast ages. The Aboriginal Australians speak of the Dreamtime and the ending of worlds. The Hopi describe multiple previous worlds, each destroyed when humanity became corrupt or when cosmic forces intervened. What if these aren't just mythological constructs? What if they're cultural memories degraded by time but preserving essential truth? What if the Fimbulwinter wasn't mythological prophecy but ancestral memory? What if 3 years became a metaphor for an incomprehensibly long cold? A winter so extended that its actual duration became impossible to preserve in oral tradition, so it was compressed into a comprehensible timeframe. 3 years we can imagine. 5,000 we cannot. So the stories that survive tell us what we can bear to know, not necessarily what actually happened. The archaeological record shows something else curious during this period. The emergence of ritual complexity. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 11,000 years ago, represents a massive investment of labor in ceremonial architecture during what should have been an era of bare survival. Massive stone pillars carved with animals and abstract symbols, arranged in circular compounds, built by hunter-gatherers who supposedly lacked the social organization for such projects. But what if Göbekli Tepe wasn't built during good times? What if it was built during the worst times? What if it represents not leisure and abundance, but desperation? a massive communal plea to whatever gods might be listening to end the cold, to bring back warmth, to allow life to flourish again. When the world is ending, humans build. We create. We reach for meaning and permanence in the face of annihilation. We gather together and erect monuments to the hope that we'll survive, that something of us will persist beyond the catastrophe. What does 5,000 years of winter do to the human mind? Not just to survival strategies, not just to technology and culture, but to consciousness itself. Imagine being born into cold, growing up knowing nothing but cold. Your parents tell stories about a warmer time, but you've never experienced it. It's mythology to you, as distant as heaven or hell. The cold is reality. The cold is normal. The cold is all there is and all there ever will be. And then imagine your children and their children and 50 generations after that, all knowing only cold. At what point does the warm world become forgotten? At what point does it cease to be history and become pure myth, indistinguishable from fantasy? Yet something persists. Some memory, some longing, some deep genetic recognition that this isn't how things should be. That we're adapted for savanna and forest, for warmth and abundance, not for tundra and scarcity. That recognition lives in the body, even when the mind has forgotten. Perhaps that's why every culture yearns for paradise, for a garden, for a golden age that existed before the fall, before the exile, before the world became hard and cold and demanding. Perhaps we're not imagining a future heaven. Perhaps we're remembering a past Eden, a time before the 5,000-year winter, a time when the world was warm and generous and life was easier, and perhaps the entire project of civilization, agriculture, cities, technology, writing, all of it, perhaps it's all an attempt to recreate that lost warmth, to build artificial abundance to replace the natural abundance we dimly remember losing, to control our environment because we remember when the environment turned against us and nearly destroyed us entirely. The transition to agriculture happens right at the end of this proposed extended cold period. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans were hunter-gatherers. Then, seemingly suddenly, in multiple locations around the world within a few thousand years of each other, humans begin domesticating plants and animals, settling into permanent villages, developing agriculture. The traditional narrative suggests this was progress. Humans getting smarter, developing new technologies, advancing up the ladder of civilization. But there's another interpretation. What if agriculture wasn't progress but desperation? What if it was the only survival strategy left after 5,000 years of cold had destroyed the abundant hunter-gatherer lifestyle our ancestors had known? Hunter-gathering requires abundant wild resources. But what if those resources were gone? What if the megafauna were extinct, the wild plants were diminished, the environment was too stressed to support the old ways? Then you'd have to invent new ways. You'd have to force the land to produce. You'd have to domesticate, cultivate, control. Not because it was better. Early agriculture was brutally hard, less healthy than hunter-gathering, more time-consuming, but because it was the only option left. We call it the Neolithic Revolution. But what if it was the post-apocalyptic survival strategy? What if agriculture is what you do after your world ends and you have to rebuild from scratch with diminished resources and traumatized populations? If you're still here, still listening, still willing to sit with these uncomfortable possibilities, then we're kindred in this exploration. And if you felt that resonance, that recognition of something true in these ancient patterns, then perhaps consider sharing this journey. Not interrupting it, just acknowledging that some truths are better witnessed together. There's a pattern in the mythology that deserves attention. Many creation myths don't begin with absolute beginning, but with recreation after destruction. The world that exists before the current world. The previous age that ended in catastrophe. The cycle of death and rebirth. The Hindu concept of yugas, vast ages of the world, each lasting thousands of years, each ending in dissolution before the next begins. We're supposedly in the Kali Yuga now, the age of darkness, but it was preceded by the Dvapara Yuga, and before that the Treta Yuga, and before that the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age. Each age represents a declining of Dharma, a moving away from perfection. But the cycle repeats. After destruction comes recreation. What if these aren't abstract philosophical concepts but preserved memories of actual cycles? What if humanity has experienced these endings before? What if the 5,000-year winter is just one we can still detect in the data, but there were others further back beyond our current ability to resolve in the geological record? The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Modern humans emerged perhaps 300,000 years ago, possibly earlier depending on how you define modern. That's a lot of time, a lot of space for cycles, a lot of room for catastrophes and recoveries and forgetting and remembering. We assume progress is linear. We assume history is a steady upward climb from primitive to advanced. But what if it's cyclical? What if civilizations rise and fall not just culturally but climatically? What if the planet itself has rhythms we don't fully understand, and humanity is just trying to survive those rhythms, building during the good times, enduring during the bad times, remembering during the recovery? The ice cores go back hundreds of thousands of years in some locations, and they show patterns. Cycles of warming and cooling, yes, but also anomalies. Periods that don't fit the predictable Milankovitch rhythms. Sudden shifts, rapid changes, events that look in the data like catastrophes. What if they were? What if Earth's climate is more chaotic than we want to believe? What if the stable Holocene we've enjoyed for the past 10,000 years, the entire span of civilization, is the anomaly and instability is the norm? That's a terrifying thought for a species that's built everything on the assumption of stability. Our agriculture, our cities, our entire global supply chain depends on predictable seasons, predictable rainfall, predictable temperature ranges. We've optimized for efficiency in a stable system. But what if the system isn't stable? What if we're just in a calm period between storms? The 5,000-year winter, if it occurred, would have been a storm. A long, slow, grinding storm that reshaped the world and everything in it. The fact that anything survived is remarkable. The fact that humans survived, adapted, persisted, and eventually thrived is extraordinary. But we didn't survive unchanged. We carry the scars. In our genes, in our myths, in our deep, irrational fears of cold, of darkness, of the world ending. Perhaps what we call anxiety isn't a malfunction but a feature. An inherited hypervigilance from ancestors who lived through millennia of genuine, existential threat. Who couldn't afford to relax because relaxation meant death. Who had to remain alert, watchful, ready for the next catastrophe. Let's return to the evidence. Because evidence is what keeps us grounded even as we explore these vast, speculative spaces. Let's examine what the cold left behind. Permafrost studies across the Arctic reveal something peculiar. Soil layers that should show continuous development instead show disruption. Organic material that began accumulating, then stopped, then started again after a gap of thousands of years. As if life tried to establish itself, failed, retreated, and only returned much later when conditions finally improved. These aren't isolated findings. They appear across Siberia, Alaska, northern Canada, Scandinavia. Different research teams, different methodologies, the same pattern. Life interrupted. Life struggling. Life barely holding on. And within those frozen soils, pollen grains tell stories. The vegetation shifted dramatically during this period. Trees retreated to isolated refugia, small pockets of survivable climate while the rest of the landscape became barren tundra. The diversity crashed. Instead of forests with dozens of species, you find monocultures of the hardiest, most cold-adapted plants. Ecological complexity collapsed into simplicity. Only the toughest survived. That's what 5,000 years of winter looks like in the pollen record. That's what planetary stress looks like at the microscopic level. Marine sediment cores add another layer to this picture. Proxy data for ocean temperatures show cooling during this period, but also something else: reduced biological productivity. The ocean food chains, which should have been recovering from full glacial conditions, instead show stress. Plankton populations crashed. Fish populations declined. The ocean itself was struggling. And that makes sense, doesn't it? If the atmosphere is cold, if there's reduced sunlight reaching the surface due to atmospheric particulates or increased cloud cover or some other mechanism, then photosynthesis suffers. Phytoplankton, the base of the marine food web, can't produce efficiently. And when the base fails, everything above it fails. The whole system cascades into crisis. But here's what's remarkable. It didn't collapse entirely. Life found a way. It always does. Contracted, simplified, endured. And when conditions finally improved, it expanded again. Slowly, tentatively, but it expanded. The resilience of life is perhaps the most important message hidden in these ancient patterns. Not that catastrophe is possible, we already know that. But that recovery is also possible. That even after millennia of hardship, given the right conditions, life returns. Complexity returns. Abundance returns. We are the proof of that recovery. We're the descendants of the survivors, yes, but we're also the beneficiaries of the planetary healing that followed the catastrophe. The warm, stable Holocene that enabled civilization is Earth's recovery from that ancient wound. We're living in the aftermath, in the long peace that followed the long war. But the question remains, what caused it? And that question haunts this exploration because we genuinely don't know. The data shows the cooling. The data shows the duration. The data shows the global extent. But the trigger, the mechanism, the cause, that remains obscure. Perhaps it was a combination of factors. Perhaps a volcanic eruption coincided with an impact event, coincided with a shift in ocean circulation, coincided with orbital variation, and the convergence of multiple stressors created a perfect storm that lasted millennia. Complex systems can exhibit nonlinear behavior. Small changes can cascade into massive effects when conditions are right. Maybe Earth's climate crossed a threshold and got stuck in a cold equilibrium state that took thousands of years to escape. Or perhaps it was something we haven't considered yet. Some mechanism we don't yet understand. Some feedback loop or tipping point or external forcing that our current models don't account for. The humility to say we don't know is crucial here. It's tempting to force explanations, to make the data fit our existing frameworks. But sometimes the most honest approach is to acknowledge uncertainty while continuing to investigate. What we do know is that it happened. Something locked the planet in extended cold. Something stressed the biosphere to the breaking point. Something forced humanity through a genetic bottleneck and reshaped our species. And something, eventually, released that grip and allowed warmth to return. In our current moment, facing climate change and environmental disruption, there's a temptation to look for lessons in the past. To ask, how did our ancestors survive? What strategies did they employ? What can we learn from their endurance? But the lesson might be simpler and more sobering than we'd like. They survived by being few, by being mobile, by being tough and resourceful and incredibly resilient. They survived by accepting catastrophic loss and continuing anyway. They survived because some of them got lucky, lived in the right refugia, had the right adaptations, made the right choices without knowing they were right. You can't plan for 5,000 years of winter. You can only endure it, and hope that you're among the survivors when it finally ends. These thoughts might accompany you into sleep tonight, if that's where this exploration is taking you. Or they might spark further curiosity, further questions. Either way, if you've journeyed this far into the cold with us, know that the path continues. There are always deeper mysteries, always more questions sleeping beneath the answers. The archaeological sites from this period are sparse, which makes sense given the population bottlenecks and harsh conditions. But the sites we do have show something interesting: increasing technological sophistication in hunting tools and survival gear. Not the leisurely experimentation of abundant times, but the desperate innovation of necessity. Pressure-flaked stone points become more refined, more efficient killers because every hunt matters when food is scarce. Bone needles appear, allowing the creation of sewn clothing. Not just draped hides but tailored garments that fit closely and retain heat effectively. Specialized tools for processing frozen carcasses. Innovations in firemaking and firekeeping. Evidence of pit houses dug deep into the earth for insulation. Every technological advance during this period can be read as a response to existential threat. These aren't the leisurely improvements of civilization building. These are the frantic innovations of a species fighting for survival against an environment that wants them dead. And yet, within that desperation, there's beauty. The cave art, even as it darkens and becomes more abstract, remains art. Humans under extreme stress still felt the need to create, to express, to leave marks on the world. That impulse to make meaning in the face of meaninglessness, to create beauty in the midst of horror, that might be the most essentially human response of all. There's a concept in psychology called genetic memory, the idea that experiences can be encoded not just in culture but in biology, passed down through generations via epigenetic mechanisms. It's controversial, debated, not fully understood. But studies on trauma suggest it's possible. Children of Holocaust survivors show physiological responses to stress that mirror their parents' trauma, even without direct experience of the events. Descendants of famine survivors show altered metabolism and stress responses generations later. If trauma can be inherited, if experience can be written into the body and passed down, then what would 5,000 years of winter write into our species? Perhaps our restlessness, our drive to explore, to move, to never settle fully even when we've built permanent homes. Perhaps our anxiety about resources, our tendency to hoard and plan and worry about future scarcity even in times of abundance. Perhaps our fascination with disaster narratives, our cultural obsession with apocalypse and survival scenarios. Perhaps we remember, not consciously, but in the deep structures of our nervous systems. Perhaps the 5,000-year winter lives on in us, not as history we can recall but as sensation we can't escape. Look at yourself in the mirror and ask, what am I carrying from ancestors I'll never know? What memories live in my bones? What fears inhabit my cells? What catastrophes do I prepare for without knowing why? We are not blank slates. We're the sum of every generation that preceded us, carrying their adaptations, their scars, their hard-won survival strategies. And somewhere in that inheritance is the memory of impossible cold, of a world that turned hostile, of endurance that lasted not days or months but millennia, that changes how we might understand ourselves, not as rational beings fully in control of our responses, but as creatures still shaped by ancient pressures, still adapted for a world that doesn't quite exist anymore, still carrying survival strategies that were essential then but might be maladaptive now. The hoarding instinct made sense when winters lasted centuries and food scarcity was constant. The hypervigilance made sense when threats were everywhere and relaxation meant death. The tribal loyalty made sense when your small group was all that stood between you and extinction. But in a world of abundance and relative safety, those same instincts can become pathological. We're Ice Age survivors trying to live in the Holocene. We're catastrophe-adapted beings trying to function in stability. No wonder we struggle. No wonder something always feels slightly wrong, slightly threatening, slightly uncertain even when objectively everything is fine. Perhaps that's why we're drawn to stories like this one. Stories of ancient catastrophe and survival. They resonate not because they're entertaining but because they're familiar. They touch something deep and old within us that recognizes itself in the narrative. That says, yes, this is true. I remember this. Not consciously, but somewhere deeper than consciousness. The myths preserve this memory in narrative form, but the body preserves it in sensory form. The feeling of cold wind triggering and disproportionate sense of threat. The sight of empty horizons creating vague anxiety. The sensation of hunger awakening desperate, panicked responses out of proportion to the actual danger. These aren't irrationalities. These are ancient rationalities, adapted for ancient conditions, still firing in modern contexts. And perhaps there's wisdom in that. Perhaps instead of trying to eliminate those responses, we should acknowledge them, honor them, recognize them as gifts from ancestors who loved us enough to survive so that we could exist. They endured the unendurable so that we might live in warmth and relative abundance. The least we can do is remember their struggle, even if that memory comes without words or images, even if it arrives only as sensation and instinct. If this exploration has touched something in you, some recognition or resonance, then perhaps you're feeling what I'm describing. That sense of ancient memory stirring. And if you'd like to continue walking this path of recognition, to keep exploring these deep human mysteries, your presence matters. Not to any algorithm, but to the collective exploration itself. We're remembering together. And there's power in that. Climate science shows us that Earth systems are complex, chaotic, capable of rapid nonlinear shifts. The stable climate we've enjoyed for the past 10,000 years is extraordinary in the context of the planet's history. For most of Earth's existence, the climate has been either much hotter or much colder than the present, and transitions between states can be rapid. The Younger Dryas cooling happened within a decade, possibly within a few years. The planet can shift that fast. And if it can shift into cold that quickly, it can presumably shift into other states just as rapidly. We don't have control. We have influence, yes. Human activity is certainly affecting climate now. But the deeper lesson from the ice cores and the ancient record is that we're not the only force acting on Earth systems. There are larger patterns, older rhythms, more powerful mechanisms at work. And those mechanisms don't care about human civilization or our plans or our assumptions about how things should work. The planet will do what the planet does. It has before. It will again. That's not defeatism. It's realism. It's acknowledging our true position in the cosmic order. Significant, certainly powerful even, but not ultimate. Not in control. Not immune to the forces that shape worlds. And perhaps there's freedom in that acknowledgement. If we're not in control, then we're also not solely responsible. We can do our best, make our choices, work to understand and adapt. But ultimately, we're riding currents far larger than ourselves. We're participants in planetary drama, not the authors of it. The 5,000-year winter, if it occurred as the data suggests, was such a current. A force that swept across the world and reshaped everything in its path. Humans didn't cause it, couldn't stop it, could only endure it. And somehow, against odds that seem impossible, they did endure it. They survived. They persisted. They eventually thrived again when conditions allowed. That resilience is our inheritance. Not just the trauma, but the survival. Not just the scars, but the strength. Not just the memory of cold, but the knowledge buried deep in genetic memory that cold ends. That winters, no matter how long, eventually give way to spring. That life finds a way forward even when the path seems impossible. We're the proof of that truth. We exist because they persisted. Every breath we take is a testament to their refusal to surrender. Every moment of warmth we enjoy is the reward they never lived to claim but endured to make possible. Let's talk about the recovery. Because after 5,000 years of winter, the ice cores show something remarkable. The warming, when it came, was relatively rapid. Not instant, but geological rapid. Within centuries, temperatures rebounded. Within millennia, ecosystems recovered. The world greened again. But it wasn't a return to what was before. Couldn't be. Too much had been lost. The megafauna were gone, never to return. The old ecosystems had collapsed. The world that emerged from the cold was fundamentally different from the world that entered it. This is important. This is the pattern we need to understand. Catastrophe doesn't just pause the world and then resume normal programming. It transforms. It creates new normal. The post-catastrophe world is always different from the pre-catastrophe world, even if it eventually becomes habitable again. The humans who emerged from the 5,000-year winter weren't the same humans who entered it. They couldn't be. They'd been shaped by millennia of hardship. Their populations had been devastated. Their cultures had been transformed. Their relationship with the environment had been fundamentally altered. And perhaps that transformation is what gave rise to civilization. Perhaps the humans who emerged from the cold weren't the carefree hunter-gatherers of earlier times, but something new. Something harder, something more determined, something carrying the knowledge that the world can end, and therefore must be controlled, must be shaped, must be forced to yield abundance because natural abundance can vanish. Agriculture makes sense as a post-apocalyptic technology. So do cities, permanent settlements where people can gather for security and resource sharing. So does writing, a technology for preserving knowledge because oral tradition can be lost when populations crash. So do hierarchies and organized religion and all the trappings of civilization. They're all technologies of survival. Technologies developed by people who remember at some deep level that the world almost ended. That everything can be lost. That preparation and control and organization might be the difference between extinction and persistence next time. We call it progress. We call it advancement. We tell ourselves stories about humanity's inevitable march toward greater complexity and sophistication. But what if it's not progress toward anything? What if it's flight from something? What if civilization is what you build when you're terrified of the world returning to the way it was during the long cold? That reframes everything, doesn't it? Our entire project as a species. Our cities and technologies and elaborate social structures. Not expressions of triumph, but expressions of fear. Not confidence, but anxiety. Not control, but desperate attempts to prevent a repeat of ancient catastrophe. And maybe that's okay. Maybe there's no shame in being shaped by trauma. Maybe the appropriate response to living through apocalypse is to build structures designed to prevent another one. Maybe our ancestors were right to be afraid, and we're right to carry forward that wariness. The question is whether we remember what we're afraid of, whether we understand the actual threats, or whether we've lost the memory but kept the fear, and now we apply that fear to the wrong things. We fear terrorism, crime, economic collapse, political upheaval, and those are real concerns. But they're not existential. They're not planetary. They're not the kind of catastrophe that could reduce human population to genetic bottleneck levels and persist for millennia. The real threats, climate instability, ecosystem collapse, loss of biological diversity, the kinds of systemic failures that could cascade into something truly catastrophic, those we struggle to take seriously. Perhaps because they're too big, too slow, too much like the ancient threats our nervous systems were shaped by but our conscious minds can't quite process. We're good at responding to immediate, visible, concrete threats. We're terrible at responding to slow, distributed, systemic threats. And 5,000-year winters fall into the latter category. They don't announce themselves with clear warning. They creep in gradually, year by year, decade by decade, until suddenly you realize the world has fundamentally changed and it's too late to prevent it. That's what the ice cores are trying to tell us. Not just that it happened before, but that it could happen again. Not in the same way necessarily. The mechanisms might be different, but the outcome, prolonged, severe global climate disruption that stresses the entire biosphere, that's possible. That's in the cards. That's part of Earth's behavioral repertoire. And we're not any better prepared for it than our ancestors were. We have more technology, yes. More knowledge, yes. But we also have far more people dependent on far more fragile systems. We've optimized for efficiency in stable conditions, which means we're incredibly vulnerable to instability. Our ancestors survived with populations measured in thousands. Could we survive with populations measured in billions? Could our global supply chains persist through decades of crop failures? Could our cities function without reliable agriculture? Could our social structures withstand the stress of watching the world slowly freeze? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary questions, because the ice remembers, and what it remembers could happen again. Perhaps you're wondering why this matters. Why dig into ancient catastrophes when we have enough current problems? The answer is, because the past is prologue. Because understanding how Earth's systems can behave gives us insight into how they might behave. Because our ancestors survived the unsurvivable, and there might be wisdom in understanding how. We're not trying to frighten you. If you've followed this exploration into the deep cold, you know this isn't about fear. It's about recognition. It's about understanding our place in longer stories. It's about seeing ourselves not as separate from natural history but as embedded within it. We're Ice Age survivors. We're catastrophe adapted. We carry the memories of impossible survival. And those memories, whether we consciously access them or not, shape us. They make us who we are. They influence how we respond to the world. They might even be the key to surviving the next catastrophe, whatever form it takes. The ice cores don't just show us past climate. They show us ourselves. They show us what we've survived before. And in showing us that, they offer a strange kind of hope. We've made it through before. Our ancestors endured conditions we can barely imagine. And because they did, we're here. There's something profoundly moving about holding ancient artifacts. The clay tablet pressed by Sumerian hands 5,000 years ago. The stone tool napped by fingers that knew genuine cold. The bone needle threaded by someone trying to keep their children warm during a winter that lasted generations. These objects aren't just archaeological specimens. They're messages. They're proof. They're evidence that humans were here, struggling, persisting, creating beauty and meaning even when the world was trying to erase them. And perhaps that's the ultimate message of the 5,000-year winter. We persist. Against impossible odds, through unimaginable hardship, we persist. Not because we're strong, though we can be. Not because we're smart, though we can be that too. But because we refuse to surrender. Because something in the human spirit, something ancient and stubborn and utterly unreasonable, says, no, not today, not yet. We continue. That refusal is our inheritance. More than any specific technology or cultural practice, that refusal to give up is what our ancestors passed to us. It's written in our DNA. It's embedded in our stories. It's the foundation of everything we've built. And perhaps it's also our responsibility to the future, to pass that same refusal forward, to ensure that whatever catastrophes might come, and they will come because that's how Earth works, future humans will have the knowledge, the tools, the cultural memory to persist through them. That's why stories like this matter. Not because they're entertaining, though they can be. Not because they're comforting, because they're often not. But because they're true in the deepest sense. They connect us to our ancestors, to our planet, to the vast sweep of time that made us possible. You're part of that story. Everyone listening to these words is part of it. We're all descendants of the survivors. We all carry the genetic legacy of people who refused to die during the long cold. And in carrying that legacy, we have an obligation to remember, to honor, to learn from their endurance. The ice cores will continue to be drilled. New techniques will be developed. New data will emerge. And perhaps eventually we'll identify the specific mechanism that caused the 5,000-year winter. Perhaps we'll find the smoking gun, the clear evidence of exactly what happened. Or perhaps we won't. Perhaps the cause will remain mysterious, lost to time, knowable only by its effects. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some mysteries should remain mysterious. Perhaps the not knowing is part of the lesson, that we can't control everything, can't explain everything, can't predict everything, and must learn to live with uncertainty. What we can know, what the evidence clearly shows, is that the cold happened, that it lasted, that it transformed everything, and that life, stubborn, resilient, adaptable life, found a way through. That's not a small thing. That's everything. As we emerge from this exploration, as we return to our warm rooms and stable climate and modern conveniences, let's carry something of the ice with us. Not the fear of it, not the trauma of it, but the recognition of it. The acknowledgement that we live in extraordinary times. That the warm stability we enjoy is both precious and precarious. That it was purchased with the suffering of countless generations who endured the cold so that we might know warmth. And let's carry forward their refusal to surrender, their determination to persist, their insistence on creating beauty and meaning even in the darkest times. Because that's what made us. That's what we are. That's what we must continue to be, whatever challenges lie ahead. The 5,000-year winter ended. The ice retreated. The world warmed. Life expanded again into the recovered spaces. And humans, traumatized, transformed, but undefeated, began building the civilizations that would eventually lead to this moment. To you, listening to these words. To me, speaking them. To all of us, connected across time and space by the shared story of human persistence. There's poetry in that. There's meaning in that. There's hope in that. Not naive hope. Not the hope that says everything will be fine without effort. But the deeper hope that says, even when things are not fine, even when the world turns hostile, even when catastrophe seems certain, humans find a way. We adapt. We endure. We persist. And eventually, when conditions allow, we thrive again. That's the message written in ice. That's the truth preserved in ancient bones and art and genetic signatures. That's what our ancestors are trying to tell us across the millennia. We made it through. You're the proof. Now make sure the story continues. If you've traveled this far into the cold with us, If you've sat with these uncomfortable truths and ancient mysteries, then you understand what we're doing here. We're not just recounting history. We're remembering ourselves. We're reconnecting with the deep human story that made us possible. And in doing so, we're preparing for whatever comes next. Because something will come next. Earth's systems guarantee that. The climate will shift again. Ecosystems will face new pressures. Humanity will face new challenges. And when those moments arrive, we'll draw on the same reserves of resilience and adaptability and stubborn refusal that got our ancestors through the 5,000-year winter. We're not separate from them. We're not different from them. We're them continued. We're the same story, still being told, still being lived, still unfolding in ways we can't predict or control, but can influence through our choices and our courage and our willingness to persist against the odds. That's what the ice remembers. That's what the bones whisper. That's what the ancient art proclaims across the ages. We were here. We survived. We mattered. And now it's your turn to carry the story forward. Sleep well, knowing you're part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. Rest in the warmth that was purchased at such terrible cost. Dream, perhaps, of ice and endurance and the slow, stubborn persistence of life against all attempts to extinguish it. And when you wake, remember, you're a survivor too, not of catastrophes you've personally faced, but of catastrophes your ancestors faced on your behalf. Their strength is your inheritance. Their refusal is your foundation. Their story is your story. The 5,000-year winter ended, but its lessons remain. Its memory persists, not as history in books, but as truth in bones, as instinct in cells, as the fundamental knowledge that we've survived the unsurvivable before, and we can do it again if we must. That's not comfort. That's not reassurance. That's something deeper and more real, recognition of who we are, of what we're capable of what we carry within us from all those who came before. The ice remembers, and now so do you. Let's return to the beginning, to the question that started this journey. What if human history once included a 5,000-year world winter? We've explored the evidence. The ice cores with their chemical signatures of prolonged cold. The cave art shifting from abundance to desperation. The synchronized population crashes across multiple species. The genetic bottlenecks. The pollen records showing ecosystem collapse. The sediment layers going silent. All of it pointing to the same conclusion. Something happened. Something global. Something that lasted not years but millennia. And yet, despite all this evidence, despite the clear signals in multiple independent data sources, the cause remains obscure. We have theories. We have possibilities. We have mechanisms that could explain parts of the puzzle. But the complete picture eludes us. Perhaps that's the final lesson of the ice. That despite our technology, despite our sophisticated analysis techniques, despite our accumulated knowledge, there are still mysteries. There are still unknowns. There are still questions that don't have neat, satisfying answers. The universe doesn't owe us explanations. Earth doesn't owe us comprehensibility. The past doesn't arrange itself for our convenient understanding. Sometimes things happen, leave evidence, and that evidence is all we get. The why remains silent, and there's a kind of wisdom in accepting that, in saying this happened. We don't know exactly why, but it happened and it mattered and it shaped everything that came after. That's enough. That's the truth we can access. And it's a profound truth even without complete mechanistic understanding. Our ancestors who lived through the cold didn't know why it was happening either. They didn't have ice cores or climate models or genetic analysis. They just had the cold itself. The daily, brutal, relentless cold. And they persisted anyway, without understanding, without explanation, without the comfort of knowing when or if it would end. If they could endure the reality without understanding the cause, we can certainly study the evidence without having all the answers. We can honor their experience by acknowledging it, even when we can't fully explain it. And perhaps there's power in mystery. Perhaps the questions without answers are the ones that keep us searching, keep us curious, keep us humble. Perhaps the 5,000-year winter remains partially mysterious not despite our science but because of the limitations inherent in all science. We're creatures of the present trying to reconstruct the past from fragmentary evidence, and some fragments are simply lost to time. But what we can reconstruct is enough. It's enough to know that the cold happened. It's enough to know that it transformed the world. It's enough to know that humans survived it and emerged changed. That knowledge alone is valuable. Contextualizes us. It explains things about human nature and human culture that otherwise seem arbitrary or puzzling. Why are we so obsessed with survival narratives? Why do apocalyptic stories resonate so deeply across all cultures? Why do we feel compelled to prepare, to hoard, to plan for disasters that may never come? Because we're descended from people who lived through an actual apocalypse that lasted 5,000 years. It's not paranoia, it's ancestral wisdom. Why do we find harsh environments oddly compelling? Why does part of us admire the ascetic, the minimalist, the survivalist? Because simplicity was survival for our ancestors. Excess was impossible during the cold. Only the essential persisted. And that value, focus on the essential, eliminate the unnecessary, might be cultural memory from a time when it was literally the difference between life and death. Why do we long for spring with an intensity that seems out of proportion to the actual experience? Why does the first warm day after winter feel like rebirth? Because for our ancestors, spring wasn't just a season. It was salvation. It was the brief window when food was available, when life could expand again, when the pressure of survival eased just enough to breathe. That longing is old. It's ancient. It's genetic. These aren't just poetic interpretations. These are potential explanations for deep human behaviors and drives that otherwise seem disproportionate to our current circumstances. We're not crazy for feeling these things. We're carriers of ancient, appropriate responses to ancient, real threats. The threats have changed, but the responses remain. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need to pathologize or eliminate these drives. Maybe we need to understand them, honor them, and channel them appropriately. Use the survival drive to prepare for real current threats. Use the longing for spring to appreciate the warmth and stability we have. Use the ancestral memory of hardship to cultivate gratitude for abundance. The ice has given us a gift, if we're willing to receive it. Not just historical knowledge, but self-knowledge. Not just climate data, but human insight. Not just evidence of catastrophe, but evidence of survival. Evidence that we've done this before. Evidence that we can do it again if necessary. As you drift towards sleep now, if that's where this journey is taking you, let these thoughts settle gently. Let the weight of deep time and ancient survival rest lightly on your consciousness. You're safe. You're warm. You're in the good time, the warm interglacial, the brief flowering of civilization between catastrophes. Enjoy it. Appreciate it. Rest in it. But know, too, that you carry within you the capacity for so much more than comfort. You carry the strength of survivors, the adaptability of ancestors who faced down the impossible and refused to yield, the creativity of people who made art even in the coldest, darkest times, the stubbornness of a species that simply will not go extinct no matter what the planet throws at us. That's your inheritance. Not just the trauma, though that's there too, but the triumph. The survival, the persistence, the unbreakable core of humanity that looks at a 5,000-year winter and says, "Fine, we'll endure it, we'll find a way, we'll make it through." And we did, and we will. That's the message of the ice. That's what the cold is trying to tell us, if we're willing to listen. Not that we're doomed, not that catastrophe is inevitable, but that we're capable of surviving catastrophes we can barely imagine. That we've already proven that capacity. That it's not theoretical or aspirational. It's historical fact, written in our genes and our bones and the ice itself. We are survivors. We are adapters. We are persisters. And that's not going to change no matter what comes next. The caves hold one final piece of this puzzle. Not the famous caves with their stunning Paleolithic art, but the smaller, forgotten ones. The ones that served as shelters during the long cold. The ones where humans huddled together for warmth, shared resources, told stories, and somehow maintained the spark of culture even when the world outside was trying to extinguish them. Archaeological excavations of these refuge caves show layers of occupation spanning thousands of years. Not continuous occupation, people came and went as conditions fluctuated, but repeated use over millennia. The same caves over and over, generation after generation. Because these places worked. These places kept people alive. And that knowledge was preserved and passed down and acted upon. Inside these caves, archaeologists find something remarkable. Evidence of community. Shared hearths. Communal food preparation areas. Careful curation of tools and resources. And burials. So many burials, some of them clearly ceremonial, clearly honoring the dead with whatever grave goods the living could spare from their meager possessions. That's what humanity looks like under extreme stress. Not the brutal survivalism of popular imagination. Not every person for themselves, but cooperation, sharing, ritual, the maintenance of social bonds even when material resources are scarce. Perhaps especially when resources are scarce, because that's when cooperation matters most. The 5,000-year winter didn't just test human physical resilience. It tested our social technology, our ability to work together, share resources, maintain cultural continuity across generations of hardship. And somehow we passed that test. The refugees in the caves didn't descend into chaos. They maintained community. They maintained culture. They maintained their humanity. That's extraordinary. That's perhaps the most important finding of all, because it means that even in the worst conditions, even facing existential threats, even watching the world freeze around them, humans retain the capacity for cooperation, for kindness, for cultural transmission. We didn't become monsters. We became more essentially human. And perhaps that's the core of what made survival possible. Not just the individual's ability to endure cold or find food, but the community's ability to function as a unit, to support its members, to share knowledge and resources and hope. Individual genius might invent new tools, but only collective action preserves those inventions across generations. Only community ensures that when one person falls, others are there to carry on. The Ice Age survivors weren't lone wolves. They were pack animals. They survived together or not at all. And they chose together. That choice echoes through everything that came after. The agricultural communities that emerged post-catastrophe. The cities that grew from those communities. The complex societies that eventually spanned continents. All of it built on the foundation of cooperation established in the caves during the long cold. We think of civilization as a triumph of individual brilliance. Great leaders, inventors, thinkers who pushed humanity forward. And yes, individuals matter. But the deeper truth is that civilization is a triumph of cooperation. Of our collective ability to work together toward common goals. To share knowledge. To build on what previous generations accomplished. To maintain social bonds even under stress. That technology, social cooperation, might be more important than any physical technology we've ever developed. More important than fire, than agriculture, than writing, than computers. Because without cooperation, none of those other technologies would persist. They'd be discovered and lost, each generation starting over. But cooperation allows accumulation. It allows progress. It allows the building of something greater than any individual could create. And we learned that lesson, or perhaps had it reinforced, during the 5,000-year winter. When cooperation meant survival and isolation meant death. When sharing was the only way to ensure everyone had enough. When maintaining social bonds was literally what kept communities alive. So when we look at modern human society, with all its complexity and problems and achievements, we're looking at the legacy of the caves. We're looking at what cooperation can build, given enough time. We're looking at what survivors create when the threat finally passes and resources become available again. Cities are just elaborate caves. Governments are just formalized cooperation. Economies are just sophisticated resource-sharing systems. All of it traceable back to those dark, cold refugia where our ancestors chose community over individualism and survived because of that choice. And if you're wondering whether this journey has a destination, whether these explorations lead somewhere concrete, they do. They lead to understanding. They lead to recognition of our deep past and how it shapes our present. They lead to gratitude for the survivors who made our existence possible. And if that resonates, if you'd like to continue these explorations into the deep structures of human history, then we'll be here, walking these paths, asking these questions. Consider joining us, not just for this exploration, but for the many others that follow similar trails into the deep past. The 5,000-year winter ended approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, give or take. The warming was relatively rapid in geological terms. Within centuries, temperatures had rebounded to near-modern levels. Within millennia, ecosystems had recovered much of their complexity and productivity. The ice retreated. The world greened. Life expanded explosively into the recovered territories. And humans emerged from their refugia, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence as they realized the cold wasn't coming back, that this warmth might last. They spread across continents again. They diversified culturally and linguistically. They began experimenting with new technologies, agriculture, animal domestication, permanent settlements. They began building the civilizations that would eventually produce writing, mathematics, philosophy, science. All of it made possible by the survivors of the cold. All of it built on the foundation of cooperation learned in the caves. All of it carrying forward the genetic and cultural memory of the 5,000-year winter. We are the inheritors of that legacy. We live in the world the survivors built. We enjoy the warmth they never knew would come. We pursue the dreams they couldn't afford to have while focused on mere survival. We are their reward, their justification, their vindication. We're the proof that their suffering meant something, that their persistence achieved something, that their refusal to surrender led somewhere. That's both humbling and empowering. Humbling because we owe everything to people we'll never know, whose names are lost, whose faces we can't reconstruct, whose specific stories are gone forever. Empowering because we carry their strength, their resilience, their capacity for survival under impossible conditions. We are them continued. We are the same story still unfolding. And whatever challenges we face now or in the future, we face them with the accumulated experience of every generation that preceded us, including those who survived 5,000 years of winter and emerged on the other side ready to rebuild the world. That's not a small inheritance. That's everything. As we approach the end of this exploration, it's worth considering what we've actually been doing here. Not just recounting climate data or archaeological findings, though we've done that. Not just speculating about ancient catastrophes, though we've done that too. But something deeper, something more personal. We've been reconnecting with the long story, the deep story, the story that makes us human, not just physically but existentially. The story of where we came from, what we've endured, what we've overcome. And in reconnecting with that story, we've been reconnecting with ourselves. With the parts of us that don't make sense in modern contexts but make perfect sense in ancient ones. With the drives and fears and longings that seemed irrational but are actually deeply rational responses to real historical pressures. You are not broken for feeling anxious in times of abundance. You're carrying forward a survival trait that kept your ancestors alive during scarcity. You are not strange for feeling drawn to disaster narratives. You're engaging with ancestral memory of actual disasters survived. You are not weird for longing for spring with irrational intensity. You're experiencing a deep, ancient recognition that warm seasons mean life and cold seasons mean death. None of this is pathology. All of it is inheritance. And understanding the inheritance, understanding where these feelings come from, doesn't eliminate them, but it contextualizes them. It makes them make sense. It allows you to work with them rather than against them. The 5,000-year winter, whether you consciously knew about it before tonight or not, has been shaping you your entire life. It's in your genes. It's in your instincts. It's in the stories your culture tells and the values your society holds and the way your nervous system responds to the world. It's everywhere once you know to look for it. And now you know. Now you can see it. Now you can recognize the Ice Age survivor in yourself and others. The stubborn refusal to give up. The tendency to prepare for worst-case scenarios. The deep appreciation for warmth and abundance. the commitment to community and cooperation, the reverence for those who came before, all of it traceable to the long cold and the lessons learned during it. This is what deep history offers. Not just facts about the past, but understanding of the present. Not just knowing what happened, but knowing why you are the way you are. Not just information, but integration. The past and present coming together in a coherent narrative that makes your life make more sense. And perhaps that's why explorations like this resonate so deeply. Why people are drawn to this kind of content. Not because it's entertaining, though it can be. Not because it's comforting, because often it's not. But because it's true. Because it touches something real and ancient within us that recognizes itself in the narrative. Because it offers context for the parts of ourselves we struggle to understand. You're not separate from history. You are history still happening, still unfolding, still being shaped by forces that began long before you were born and will continue long after you're gone. But within that vast sweep of time, you matter. Your choices matter. Your persistence matters. Because you're carrying the story forward, adding your chapter to the vast book of human experience. What chapter will you write? What will future archaeologists find when they dig through the layers of our time? What evidence will we leave of how we responded to our challenges? Will they see cooperation or conflict? Wisdom or foolishness? The continuation of the survivor spirit or its abandonment? Those aren't rhetorical questions. They're real questions that our actions are answering right now. We're living in the warm times, yes, but warm times don't last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Change is constant. And how we respond to change, how we maintain community and culture and cooperation through stress, that determines whether we're worthy inheritors of the Ice Age survivors or just lucky beneficiaries who squandered their gift. The ice is still out there, still keeping records, still preserving evidence. And someday, perhaps thousands of years from now, someone will drill into ice that's forming today and read the chemical signatures of our atmosphere, our climate, our choices. What will that ice tell them about us? Will it show wisdom, foresight, the maintenance of the survivor spirit even in times of abundance? Or will it show complacency, wastefulness, the loss of ancient wisdom in the comfort of temporary plenty? We get to choose. Every day, with every action, we're choosing what legacy to leave. What story to add to the long human narrative. What message to encode in ice and bone and artifact for future generations to discover. That's the real lesson of the 5,000-year winter. Not just that our ancestors survived, but that they survived on purpose. They made choices to cooperate, to share, to maintain culture, to persist. And those choices made all the difference. Those choices led to us. Now it's our turn. Our time. Our opportunity to prove worthy of the inheritance. To honor the survivors not just by remembering them but by emulating them. By maintaining the survivor spirit even when survival isn't immediately threatened. By choosing cooperation over conflict, community over individualism, long-term thinking over short-term comfort. That's how you honor ancestors you'll never know. That's how you thank people who suffered so you could live in warmth. That's how you justify their sacrifice and validate their persistence. By living well, by choosing wisely, by maintaining and transmitting the culture they preserved through the coldest, darkest times. You're part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. Never forget that. Never underestimate the weight and value of that inheritance. And never doubt your capacity to carry it forward, whatever challenges you face. You're the descendant of people who survived 5,000 years of winter. Whatever problems you're dealing with, they're survivable. Whatever challenges you're facing, they're surmountable. Not easily, perhaps. Not without effort and cost. But possible. Because survival is what we do. It's what we've always done. It's encoded in our genes and our culture and our deep, stubborn human refusal to surrender to impossibility. That's who you are. That's what you carry. That's your inheritance and your responsibility and your power. The 5,000-year winter ended. But the survivors, the people who made it through, they didn't end. They continued. They're still continuing. In you. In everyone. In the vast, interconnected human story that spans from the first fires in African caves to whatever future we create. You're not an observer of this story. You're not audience. You're a participant, an active contributor, a writer of the next chapter. And that matters more than you might realize. The ice holds one final secret, one we haven't fully articulated yet, but which underlies everything we've explored. It's not about climate or survival or even about human history specifically. It's about time. We live in the present moment, but we're shaped by vast stretches of time we never experienced. We make choices based on instincts developed across thousands of generations. We respond to threats that no longer exist and prepare for dangers we can't even name. We're simultaneously creatures of now and creatures of deep time, and reconciling those two aspects of ourselves is perhaps the great challenge of human consciousness. The 5,000-year winter exemplifies this tension. It's gone. It ended 10,000 years ago. No living human has any direct memory of it. And yet it shapes us still. It influences our psychology, our culture, our species-level behavior patterns. The past isn't past. It's present, embedded in every cell and synapse, subtly but profoundly affecting everything we do. Most of the time we don't notice this. Most of the time we go about our modern lives unaware of the ancient forces still operating through us. But sometimes, in moments of quiet contemplation, in the liminal space between waking and sleep, in explorations like this one, we catch glimpses of the deep structure. We sense the presence of the past within the present. We feel the weight of inherited experience. And in those moments, something shifts. We stop being merely individuals navigating personal challenges and become conscious links in a chain stretching back beyond memory and forward beyond imagination. We become aware of ourselves as temporal beings, existing not just in the present but across time, connected to ancestors and descendants in a web of causality and consequence that gives our brief lives cosmic significance. That awareness can be overwhelming. It can make personal problems feel trivial in the context of deep time. But it can also be liberating, because if you're part of something that vast, that ancient, that resilient, then your individual fears and failures diminish in importance. You're not alone. You're not even primarily yourself. You're a temporary manifestation of something far older and more durable than any individual consciousness. Your ancestors survived the 5,000-year winter. Literally, physically. Without them, you wouldn't exist. Every moment of cold they endured, every meal they shared, every decision to persist rather than surrender, all of that led directly to you. You're the answer to their suffering, the justification for their persistence, the proof that it was worth it. And someday, if humans persist, your descendants will look back across similarly vast stretches of time and realize the same thing, that you were part of what made their existence possible, that your choices, your persistence, your willingness to maintain the story mattered, that they exist because you existed and refused to break the chain. This is what consciousness allows. Not just awareness of the present moment, but awareness of our position in the vast flow of time. The ability to look backward and forward simultaneously. To understand ourselves as both products of the past and creators of the future. To bear the weight of inheritance while accepting the responsibility of legacy. The ice understands time in ways we struggle to comprehend. It accumulates slowly, layer by patient layer, each one preserving a moment of atmospheric history. It exists in a different temporal frame than we do, thinking in millennia where we think in decades, measuring significance by what persists rather than what happens quickly. Perhaps that's why ice core data is so profound. It's not just information about past climate. It's a window into deep time itself. It's evidence that the present moment is just one brief instant in a vastly longer story. It's proof that the timescale we operate on, years, decades, a human lifetime, is not the only valid timescale. That there are longer rhythms, slower patterns, more patient forces at work. And when we align ourselves with those longer rhythms, something changes. Anxieties about immediate problems don't disappear, but they're contextualized, placed within a framework that makes them manageable. Because if your ancestors survived 5,000 years of winter, you can survive your current challenges. If the ice can accumulate patiently for millennia, you can persist patiently through your difficulties. This isn't minimizing real problems. It's providing perspective. It's accessing a source of strength and resilience that exists beyond your individual capacity. The accumulated survival wisdom of everyone who came before you. As this exploration draws toward its close, as we prepare to return from the deep cold to the warm present, take a moment to feel what we've done here. We've traveled across 10,000 years. We've explored evidence from multiple scientific disciplines. We've confronted uncomfortable possibilities about Earth's climate systems. We've reconnected with our deep ancestry. We've contextualized ourselves within the vast human story. And if you've stayed with us through this entire journey, if you've allowed these ideas to settle into your consciousness, then you've changed. Not dramatically, not in ways you might immediately notice, but changed nonetheless, because you can't truly understand your connection to deep time without being transformed by that understanding. You can't genuinely recognize yourself as an Ice Age survivor without that recognition affecting how you move through the world. You're different now than you were at the beginning of this exploration. More connected, more contextualized, more aware of the forces that made you possible and the responsibilities that awareness entails. And that difference, subtle as it might be, matters. If you'd like to continue these explorations, to keep diving into the deep structures of human experience and history, know that this is just one of many paths through the ancient landscape. There are other mysteries sleeping beneath the surface of accepted narratives. Other questions whispering from the edges of our understanding. Other stories waiting to be remembered. The ice remembers everything, and we're only just beginning to learn its language, to decode its messages, to understand the full scope of what it's been trying to tell us about our planet, our species, our position in the vast sweep of time. But for tonight, for this exploration, we've learned enough. We've ventured far enough into the cold. We've confronted the evidence and sat with the implications and reconnected with our survivor ancestry. That's sufficient for one journey. The warmth is waiting. The present moment is waiting. Your life, with all its immediate concerns and challenges and joys, is waiting. It's time to return to it. But you're returning changed, carrying something of the ice with you, carrying the recognition of who you are and where you came from and what you're capable of. The ending of a 5,000-year winter must have been extraordinary. Imagine being part of the first generation to notice that the cold was truly, finally releasing its grip, that the warm seasons were lasting longer, that the ice was retreating not just locally but everywhere, that life was returning to landscapes that had been barren for as long as cultural memory extended. It must have felt like resurrection, like the world itself coming back to life. After millennia of decline, of loss, of grinding persistence through impossible conditions, suddenly expansion, growth, possibility, the slow, cautious realization that the worst was over, that survival had succeeded, that life could be more than bare endurance again. The archaeological record shows exactly this, a flowering, an explosion of cultural diversity and technological innovation as humans spread rapidly across continents. Not the slow, conservative movement of people just trying to survive, but the aggressive, creative expansion of people who suddenly had resources and energy for experimentation. For art, for building, for fighting, unfortunately, but also for trading, for connecting, for sharing innovations across increasingly large networks. The world that emerged from the cold was our world. The Holocene, the past 10,000 years of relative climate stability that allowed civilization to develop. And perhaps that stability felt even more precious, more valuable to the immediate survivors. Perhaps they appreciated warmth more deeply than we can, because they knew cold, real cold, eternal cold, and they knew it was over. Or did they? That's a haunting question. Did they know it was over? Or did they live with the fear that winter could return? That the cold might come back? That this warmth was temporary? A brief reprieve before the ice returned? If they carried that fear, and it would be natural if they did, then perhaps that fear is what drove the civilizational project. The urgent need to build permanent structures, to develop reliable agriculture, to create systems that could withstand disruption. Not building for the present but building for the next catastrophe. Preparing for the cold's return by developing the technologies and social structures that would allow survival even if winter came back. And perhaps we're still doing that. Still building, still preparing, still operating under the unconscious assumption that the good times won't last, that catastrophe could return, that we need to be ready. If that's true, then our entire civilization, with all its ambition and anxiety and ceaseless striving, is a monument to Ice Age trauma. We're still trying to survive a winter that ended 10,000 years ago, still preparing for threats that may never return, still unable to fully relax into the warm abundance we've been granted because we remember, at some deep level, that abundance can vanish. That's both sad and admirable. Sad because it means we can't fully enjoy what we have, always anticipating its loss. Admirable because it means we take nothing for granted, always recognizing the precarity of our position. The survivors who emerged from the cold were right to be cautious, right to prepare, right to build resilience into their systems, and we're right to continue that tradition. But we can also recognize it for what it is. Not wisdom about present threats, but wisdom inherited from past threats. Not realistic assessment of current conditions, but trauma response to ancient conditions. And recognizing that allows us to make conscious choices about which inherited responses to maintain and which to set aside. We don't need to live in constant fear. The 5,000-year winter is over. The Holocene has been remarkably stable. We're not facing imminent return to glacial conditions. If anything, we're facing the opposite problem. The inherited fear responses that served our ancestors well may not serve us well in our current context. But the inherited capacity for cooperation, for community, for long-term thinking, for maintaining culture through stress, those we should definitely keep. Those are timeless survival technologies. Those work in any context. Those are worth preserving and transmitting to future generations regardless of what specific challenges they face. So as we close this exploration, as we prepare to return fully to the present moment, let's be conscious about what we're carrying forward from the ice. Let's take the strength and leave the fear. Let's take the cooperation and leave the trauma. Let's take the wisdom and leave the wounds. We're not prisoners of the past. We're students of it. And good students learn what's useful while setting aside what's not. We can honor our ancestors without being controlled by their fears. We can maintain the survivor spirit without living in constant survival mode. We can remember the cold without letting it freeze our capacity for joy in the warmth. That's the synthesis. That's the integration. That's what it means to be conscious inheritors of deep time rather than unconscious victims of it. We acknowledge the past, we learn from it, we carry forward its gifts, but we're not limited by it. We're free to create new responses to new conditions while building on the foundation our ancestors established. The 5,000-year winter shaped us profoundly, but it doesn't define us entirely. We're more than just Ice Age survivors. We're also agricultural innovators and city builders and artists and philosophers and scientists and dreamers. We're everything that became possible after the cold ended. We're the flourishing that the survivors made possible but never fully enjoyed themselves. And perhaps that's our gift to them, to fully live the lives they made possible, to enjoy the warmth they never knew would come, to build the civilizations they could only dream of during the cold, to be the proof that their suffering meant something, that their persistence achieved something, that their refusal to surrender led to something beautiful. We are that something beautiful, flawed certainly, struggling, often, but also magnificent, creative, compassionate, capable of extraordinary cooperation and achievement, capable of understanding our own deep history and learning from it, capable of consciousness itself, that strange, recursive awareness that allows us to think about thinking, to remember remembering, to be simultaneously subject and object of our own contemplation. The ice gave us many gifts, but perhaps the greatest gift was time. The 5,000 years of winter, as terrible as they were, acted as a forcing function, a crucible, a test that eliminated the weak, the uncooperative, the inflexible, and preserved the strong, the communal, the adaptable. Not strong in the sense of individually powerful, but strong in the sense of collectively resilient. Not inflexible adherence to tradition, but adaptable willingness to innovate while maintaining core values. We passed that test. Our ancestors passed it, and we carry the traits that allowed them to pass it. We're the genetic and cultural inheritors of the hardest test our species ever faced. And we carry the proof of passing in every breath, every thought, every act of cooperation and creation. There's a silence in the ice that speaks louder than any words, a stillness that contains multitudes, a cold that holds memory. And if you listen carefully, if you quiet the noise of the present moment and allow yourself to hear what the deep past is whispering, you can hear it. The voices of the ancestors, the lessons of the long cold, the truth that we've been exploring throughout this journey. That truth is simple and profound. We persist. Not because it's easy. Not because we're guaranteed success. Not because the universe owes us survival. But because persistence is what we do. It's what we've always done. It's what we'll continue to do as long as there are humans drawing breath and making choices about how to meet the challenges before them. The 5,000-year winter could have been the end of our species. The conditions were certainly severe enough. The population crashed to levels that approached the minimum viable population for a large mammal species. A few more stressors, a bit more bad luck, and we could have joined the megafauna in extinction. Homo sapiens could have been just another Pleistocene casualty, known only from fossils and the archaeological remains of a briefly interesting but ultimately unsuccessful experiment in large-brained primates. But that's not what happened. Against odds that seem impossible in retrospect, we survived. We adapted. We cooperated. We innovated. We maintained culture through millennia of hardship. And we emerged on the other side ready not just to survive but to thrive. That's not a small thing. That's everything. That's the core of what makes us human. Not our intelligence alone. Not our tool use alone. Not any single trait but the combination of them all in service of collective survival. We're not the fastest or strongest or most specialized species. But we might be the most persistent. The most stubbornly, unreasonably, magnificently persistent. And persistence, it turns out, is enough. Given enough persistence, intelligence can develop solutions. Cooperation can distribute resources. Innovation can create new possibilities. Persistence is the foundation on which everything else builds. Without it, all the intelligence and creativity in the world amounts to nothing. With it, even desperate situations can become survivable. The ice teaches us that lesson if we're willing to learn it. Not that survival is guaranteed, it's not. Not that catastrophe can be avoided, it can't. But that persistence through catastrophe can lead to recovery and flourishing on the other side. That the worst times don't last forever. That winter, no matter how long, eventually yields to spring. We need that lesson now. Not because we're facing a 5,000-year winter, we're not. But because we're facing challenges that require the same fundamental response. Persistence. Climate change. Ecological disruption. Social fragmentation. The challenges differ, but the required response remains constant. We must persist. We must cooperate. We must maintain culture and community through stress. We must be willing to make sacrifices now for survival later. Our ancestors had no choice but to respond that way. We have choices, which makes our situation both easier and harder. Easier because we're not facing immediate existential threat. Harder because without that immediate pressure, it's tempting to defer, to avoid, to hope that somehow the problems will resolve themselves without requiring sacrifice or change from us. But the ice reminds us that problems don't resolve themselves. Catastrophes don't avoid species that ignore them. The climate doesn't care about human wishes or political positions or economic concerns. It does what it does according to physical laws that operated long before humans existed and will continue long after we're gone. We can choose to face that reality with the same courage our ancestors showed. The same willingness to adapt and cooperate and persist through difficulty. Or we can choose to pretend it isn't real, to prioritize comfort over survival, short-term ease over long-term persistence. But choosing the latter doesn't make the problems disappear. It just makes us less prepared to face them when they become undeniable. The survivors of the 5,000-year winter didn't have the luxury of denial. The cold was immediate, physical, undeniable. They faced it because they had no choice. We still have choices, which means we can choose to face our challenges proactively, with wisdom and foresight, or reactively, with panic and chaos. but face them we will one way or another. The choice is in the timing and manner, not in whether. This isn't meant to frighten you. If you've followed this exploration to this point, you already understand that fear isn't the appropriate response to deep challenges. Respect, yes. Recognition, certainly, but not fear. Fear paralyzes. Respect motivates. Recognition allows planning. We need motivation and planning, not paralysis. And we need hope, not naive hope, not the hope that pretends problems don't exist, but the deeper hope that recognizes our capacity to face problems. The hope that acknowledges we've done it before under much worse conditions. The hope that trusts in human persistence and cooperation and innovation, because those traits have been tested across millennia and proven sufficient. You carry that capacity within you, the same capacity that got your ancestors through the ice, the same stubborn refusal to surrender that persisted through 5,000 years of winter, the same spark of consciousness that created art and culture and community even in the darkest times. It's not separate from you. It is you. It's the deepest, truest part of what makes you human. And when you doubt yourself, when challenges feel overwhelming, when the world seems too heavy to bear, remember, you're descended from people who survived the unsurvivable. Your existence is proof of their success. Their strength is your inheritance. Their persistence is your birthright. You don't have to be extraordinary. You just have to be what you already are, a human. Flawed, certainly. Struggling, probably. But also resilient, adaptable, capable of cooperation and community and persistence through difficulty. Capable of being part of something larger than yourself. Capable of carrying the story forward one more generation. That's enough. That's always been enough. And it will continue to be enough for whatever comes next. The ice remembers. The bones remember. The genes remember. And now, having walked this path through the deep cold, you remember too. Not with perfect clarity, we're not sure anyone remembers with perfect clarity. But with enough recognition to matter. Enough understanding to make a difference. Enough connection to the deep human story to know that you're part of it, that your choices matter, that your persistence contributes to the continuation of something vast and ancient and beautiful. We're approaching the end now, the last whispers from the ice, the final lessons from the long cold, and perhaps the most important recognition, that the 5,000-year winter, as terrible as it was, as much suffering as it caused, also gave us something invaluable. It gave us ourselves. Not physically, humans existed before the cold. But the people who emerged from that crucible were fundamentally different from the people who entered it. They'd been tested, refined, concentrated down to essential qualities. The traits that didn't contribute to survival were eliminated. The behaviors that didn't support cooperation were selected against. What persisted were the core characteristics that define humanity at its best. Resilience, cooperation, creativity, the refusal to surrender. We are the descendants of the refined version of humanity. The people who proved themselves capable of surviving literally anything the planet could throw at them. And we carry that capability forward, whether we recognize it or not. It's in our genes, our culture, our deep unconscious patterns of behavior. We are survival incarnate. That doesn't mean we're guaranteed to survive whatever comes next. It means we have the capacity to survive, the potential, the inherited tools and traits that make survival possible. But capacity must be activated. Potential must be realized. The tools must be picked up and used. And that requires conscious choice. We can choose to honor our inheritance by maintaining the traits that got our ancestors through the cold. Or we can allow those traits to atrophy, to be forgotten, to fade into irrelevance in our comfortable modern lives. We can maintain cooperation and community and long-term thinking. Or we can indulge in individualism and isolation and short-term gratification. The choice is ours in each moment. But make no mistake, those choices matter. They're not just personal decisions affecting only ourselves. They're contributions to the ongoing human story. They're the difference between honoring our ancestors' struggles and squandering their gifts. They're what determines whether we're worthy inheritors of the survivor legacy or just lucky beneficiaries who failed to maintain what we were given. That's heavy. That's serious. That's the weight of deep time and profound inheritance pressing on the present moment. And it's okay if that feels overwhelming. It should feel overwhelming. It's meant to, because it's true and truth has weight. But it's also liberating. Because if you're part of something that's significant, that ancient, that tested and proven across unimaginable hardship, then your individual limitations matter less. You're not alone. You're never alone. You're connected across time to every human who ever struggled and persisted. You're part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the first humans and forward to whoever comes last. And that chain is strong, stronger than any individual link. Strong enough to bear whatever weight is placed upon it. So when you feel weak, remember you're part of something strong. When you feel isolated, remember you're part of an endless community extending across time. When you feel like giving up, remember that giving up means breaking a chain that has never been broken, that has persisted through the 5,000-year winter and every other catastrophe our species has faced. That's not meant to guilt you into persistence. It's meant to empower you, to show you that you're not operating on your own resources alone. You have access to accumulated human strength, to the persistence of everyone who came before, to the survivor spirit that has never, across all challenges, accepted defeat as final. That spirit lives in you. It is you. And recognizing it, activating it, allowing it to inform your choices, that's how you honor the ice and the cold and the ancestors who endured both. As we close this exploration, as we prepare to return fully to the warm present, take one last journey with me to the edge of the ice. Stand there, in your imagination, at the boundary between frozen and thawed. Behind you, the cold, the silent white, the empty tundra, the world as it was during the 5,000-year winter. Before you, warmth, color, life, the world as it became after the cold released its grip. You're standing at that boundary right now, metaphorically. Behind you, the deep past with all its lessons and legacies. Before you, the open future with all its possibilities and challenges. And in this present moment, you get to choose which direction you face. Whether you orient toward the past or the future. Whether you're primarily shaped by what was or by what could be. The wise choice is both. Face forward but remember backward. Move toward the future while carrying the lessons of the past. Be simultaneously ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, respectful of what was while creating what will be. That's the integration. That's the synthesis. That's what it means to be a conscious human in the present moment. To contain multitudes, to bridge timescales, to be both product and producer of the ongoing story. You can do that. You're already doing it whether you realize it or not. Every moment you choose persistence over surrender, cooperation over isolation, long-term thinking over short-term gratification, you're doing it. You're maintaining the chain. You're honoring the inheritance. You're contributing your link to the vast human story. And that matters. Your life matters. Your choices matter. Not because you're special or chosen or extraordinary, but because you're human. And humans matter. We've proven that across millennia of persistence through impossible conditions. We've demonstrated our significance by refusing to accept insignificance. By insisting on meaning and purpose and continuation even when the universe seems indifferent. That insistence is beautiful. That refusal to surrender is magnificent. That stubborn, unreasonable, utterly human persistence is perhaps the most important thing we do. More important than any specific achievement or creation. Because without persistence, nothing else is possible. But with it, everything becomes possible eventually. The 5,000-year winter is over. But its lessons remain. Its legacy continues. Its truth persists in ice and bone and gene and culture and in you, listening to these words, connected across time to everyone who endured the cold and everyone who will face future challenges. You are the answer to their struggles, the justification for their persistence, the proof that it was all worth it. And someday, someone else will be the answer to your struggles, will justify your persistence, will prove that your efforts weren't in vain. That's the chain. That's the story. That's what the ice has been trying to tell us all along. We continue. Against all odds, through all challenges we continue. And that continuation is its own victory, its own meaning, its own purpose. Rest now. You've traveled far. You've ventured deep into the cold and returned with wisdom. Sleep well, wrapped in warmth purchased by ancient suffering. Dream of ice and persistence and the long human story that contains us all. And when you wake, remember, you're a survivor. You've always been a survivor. And you'll continue to be a survivor because that's what we do. The ice remembers, and so do you.